Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for the webinar, Is Your Current Disaster Recovery and Backup Strategy Really Enough? Brought to you by Webair and Veeam. My name is Phil Shih. I'm the Managing Director of Structure Research, and I'll be your host for today. I'll be joined today by Sagi Brody, who's the Chief Technology Officer for Webair, and Dave Russell, who's the VP of Enterprise Strategy at Veeam. So I'm going to let Segi start off. He's going to talk a little bit about himself and his company, and then we'll get rolling into the content of today. Thanks again for joining us.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks for hosting the webinar with us. As Phil mentioned, my name is Sagi Brody. I'm the CTO of Webair, and we are here to talk about fully inclusive disaster recovery strategies. Webair certainly knows a lot about that. We are a provider of hybrid cloud deployments, disaster recovery as a service, and backups as a service, and sort of encompasses all of the components that you really need for an enterprise disaster recovery strategy. We've been doing it for almost 10 years. We've been mentioned in multiple industry analyst reports, including the Gartner Magic Quadrant for Disaster Recovery as a Service as a notable vendor, as well as some of the other analyst reports out there. So thanks for having us. Dave?
Yeah, thank you very much. So Dave Russell from Veeam Software, been delivering backup replication solutions now for 12 years. Very focused on the global market and very focused on all aspects of the market, meaning from the smallest of SMBs to the largest of Fortune 100 enterprises, which is how we've amassed 375,000 customers in over 160 countries. Also, like Webair, been listed in Gartner's Magic Quadrant for a number of years, and really happy to be here on this webcast.
Thanks, guys, for the introduction, and welcome those who just are jumping on and watching the counter here. Thanks again for joining us. This is the Webair Veeam webinar. And as you can guess from this slide that you're probably viewing, we're going to be talking a lot today about DR, disaster recovery as a service. And just to set the stage before Dave and Segi go into some of the details and in and outs, just kind of want to give our sense of what DR is. I think a lot of people come into this thinking it's a lot of very it's hardware and software. It's a certain amount of technology that you kind of install, and then it's there and you go back to it when you need it. We want to make the case today, and I think you're joining us because you are suspect that this is what organizations need, especially in this environment. Is you need more than just a bit of technology that sits there. You need more than an insurance plan. What you really need is something much more comprehensive, which is something that combines a service that enables that and delivers the technology with a strategy and a solution. And so that includes a lot of these things that you see here: consistency in performance, consistency in the network, self-service capabilities, and an array of fully managed services. So I hope that kind of sets the stage for you and your decision making internally in an IT department, in a mid-sized organization or an enterprise. Really, it boils down to what's less painful. Are you going to invoke a DR strategy that you've planned well ahead of time and have a service provider potentially enable that for you, or are you going to deal very suddenly with an attack, something like a ransomware attack, when you're faced with paying a very significant penalty? You might want to, looking ahead, you might want to ask today, as you listen to all the details of our content, is what is probably going to be less painful: planning ahead and invoking that DR strategy that you set up, or having to pay the ransom and deal with it, and just the cost and the expense and the aggravation of dealing with it internally. So I'll let Dave come in and talk to give his points on modern data protection.
Yeah, thank you, Phil. So Veeam just recently concluded a global survey of 1,550 IT professionals, and just wanted to share a couple of those results. This slide here, we asked, what does a quote modern solution in data protection look like to you? And in the lighter green bars are where people were allowed to vote multiple times, and the darker green bars, they could select what was the single most important item to them. Interestingly enough, essentially, the top two are right here, but disaster recovery as a service, and be able to do DRAS through cloud services in particular came out the highest, both in terms of the single top priority as well as the blended average. And then if we think through that, a little bit more, how can that be achieved? Well, from a Veeam perspective, it's things like having just a 2-click restore to AWS or Azure Stack. It's the ability to restore any workload to vSphere through our Cloud Connect and our global Veeam cloud service provider partners like Webair. It's a data migration format that provides agility and portability of data. And that's really comes into the second point here, which is the ability to move workloads from on-prem to the cloud. And of course, once you're there, if appropriate, to go across cloud. So focusing on a hybrid cloud, multi-cloud strategy, again, using the portability of data, really key here. And cloud-to-cloud migration, we anticipate is going to become more of a demand item in the future. But in this context, being able to focus on disaster recovery to automate the recovery process and the orchestration of that and the workflows, being able to tie into automation tools becomes really important. But let's talk about some of the challenges we see with data protection. Now, when we surveyed just at the end of last year, what were some of the top challenges? And again, same concept here. The lighter green bars are where people could vote multiple times, and the darker green bars, the single most impactful item. And you can see essentially tied for the most impactful at the top here. One was staffing and the other was budget. And staffing presented itself because it was a challenge for trying to get new initiatives done. Essentially, this is saying that organizations are struggling just trying to run the business. And of course, this was conducted at a pre-COVID-19 kind of a landscape that those two issues are probably more exasperated today. So if we think about staffing budget, this is where solutions that can monitor and report, like our Veeam One solution that we'll talk through a little bit later, but also being able to really understand what's going on in your environment. That's that visibility at number 3 in our operational performance. And then just lastly, the fourth item I'll mention here, the lack of ability to support application development, DevOps, and utilizing the data that you already have. That's something where Veeam and Webair offer a capability through what we call data labs to better leverage the data and the infrastructure that you already have in place to try to overcome some of these top challenges. So thinking about that, Sagi, what we really need to do is focus on how can we ensure our requirements are being met.
Yeah, and Dave, I mean, there's so many. I mean, it's interesting when we look at sort of disaster recovery requirements for, let's say, a greenfield small, edge office deployment where we need to replicate these 10 VMs to a cloud or another location and spin them up and access them. It's pretty easy to do today, especially with a tool like Veeam. Setting up replication for a small subset of workloads or VMs and booting them up somewhere, not a problem. When you look at disaster recovery for an enterprise organization, it's much different though. The definition of what is production, what's critical it changes. If something is important for your production environment and critical, you need to find a way to replicate. And if it happens to be an old IBM server or even a new IBM server or some legacy storage or platforms, you can't ignore them. Whatever defines your critical production environment must be part of your DR strategy. You can't say yes to 95% and ignore the small components. And for the enterprise organizations, and at Webair, we've helped hundreds of enterprises build out these fully inclusive DR strategies. It can involve all the things here on the screen. It's multiple different sorts of compute platforms, not just VMs. We know those are easy, but physical Windows, physical Linux boxes, direct attached storage into VMs or physical machines. A lot of the data movers just cannot cover those. Dealing with voice circuits, VDI, and then all the compliance and security requirements of where the data can sit, how many copies are needed. And we haven't even gotten to the network, which is arguably the most important component of disaster recovery. And so we're here today really to talk about not the simple, not the easy stuff. Again, go download the community version of Veeam and get your replication set up. Take you 10 minutes. We're here to talk about, the dirty, the ugly, the legacy, and all that, because that's where it gets difficult. But I think that there are certainly ways that it can be handled through sort of the Webair and Veeam joint solution. And the first one I think where we really need to focus on is, before we can start building out our DR strategy or even enabling replication, what are we trying to protect ourselves against? Phil mentioned ransomware at the beginning, and that's a particular type of event that we might want to protect against. But typically, ransomware, or hopefully, doesn't always hit all your servers all at the same time, or it can certainly just lock up one VM. And so if one of your servers gets locked with ransomware, and your disaster recovery strategy was designed for a full site failover only, not a partial, are you really going to fail over your entire data center, your entire IT infrastructure, because one VM got locked up? Probably not. So what are the different events that you're trying to protect against? And typically, if an enterprise organization does not have any sort of disaster recovery strategy in place, we recommend starting with a full site failover scenario where your entire production infrastructure goes down. Maybe your colo somewhere, the rack goes down, or your on-prem or whatever. That's the easiest one to plan for, is a full site failover. Beyond that, then we can start looking at partial failover scenarios. I want to protect against, if one application fails, I want to fail it over to my DR site and not have to bring everything else along with it. And then from there, we can get more complicated. Let's build an active where I can run either the production or the DR site on a week-by-week basis. And so as we work with our customers to implement disaster recovery, to install Veeam and help get all this up and running, we start with, what are you trying to protect against? We know you want everything, great, but what should we focus on first? And here's some recommendations on the lowest hanging fruit. We also talk about failback considerations. A lot of people don't realize that when you fail over, failing back is not the easiest thing to do. And depending on the amount of bandwidth that you have available, and the way that your applications are interdependent internally or on third parties, it might not be the easiest thing to fail back. So do you have an appetite for some sort of maintenance window to fail back? What does that look like? How quickly do you need to fail back? Again, that has networking implications, because you might only have a gigabit pipe between your production and DR, and while you're replicating, it might only be using 10% of the link for the change data. You fell over to DR and, for a few days, and you want to fail back, you might not be able to get back immediately because your gig pipe is now maxed trying to replicate back all the change data. And so we go through the failback scenarios and look at all the options there. And then also testing. Once the replication is set up, who is responsible to test? Who within the organization? Is it an IT task? Is it an application owner task? And depending on who owns it and what the success criteria for testing looks like, we need to design the application and network consumption in a way that testing can actually take place. If your application is dependent upon third-party service providers, maybe like a financial feed or an EMR system, is it feasible? Can you actually even test your application if it's sending and transacting with data from a third party? So the ways to deal with that are, we can kind of mimic the third party, we can do some sort of double natting, but these are the questions to ask sort of at the onset for the modern enterprise. The next component that I want to touch on is networking, and here at Webair, when we help our customers sort of implement a full-on DR strategy, this is where we end up getting the deepest, because it's one thing to have a copy of your data replicated somewhere, and it's really easy. Again, just install Veeam and start replicating and your data somewhere else. That has nothing to do with the fact if your applications are actually consumable or not at the DR site or on the DR cloud. That's a networking conversation. And so we like to say the way that your users consume the applications at production, that's the way that they should be able to consume at the DR site. It shouldn't be a one-off. It shouldn't be changing a URL or having a jumble with host file. And so we go through a process of understanding what does your internal network look like, and we would hope that we can get the DR site to look and feel and act like it's a good participant on that network. If you already have a bunch of branch offices and you already have a network paradigm around how your sites are interconnected, maybe it's an MPLS network, maybe it's an SD-WAN mesh, whatever your existing strategy for internal network connectivity looks like, DR should be the same way. It shouldn't be a one-off. If you have an MPLS network with IBGP interconnected, then your DR site or DR cloud should do the same thing, and you just advertise those same IPs over. And so everything that you do today with internal networking should be done the same way with DR. I'll show you in a minute some new technologies that can be used to make that less painful. As far as the external networking goes, we typically go through a process of understanding which of our customers' assets are sort of internet facing. Are there any internet consumable applications? And if there are, how are we going to fail those over? And we typically would recommend either using low TTL DNS changes with a provider that can automate those changes. So we'll tie into the APIs of like a Route 53 or an Open DNS, and we'll automate that as part of the runbook. If it's a website, we can integrate with third-party proxying services that provide global load balancing, so your DNS doesn't change. Or you always have that BGP failover. If you own your own IP blocks, you can obviously advertise them from the DR site. But going back to the failover event type, remember, if you advertise your entire C-class out of the DR site, it's only going to help you in a full site failover scenario. It does not help you with partial failovers at all. And then the way that you integrate to third parties is important too. If you have a certain number of connections at your production site, let's say a private connection, let's say if you're a bank to Fiserv, and maybe that private connection to your MPLS network, and maybe you do have one to AWS for some application that needs it. Typically what people do is they have to go and duplicate all of those links at the DR site, a one-for-one, which now means you're paying double for all those links. You're managing double the amount of interconnects and routers and IPs, and that's a lot of overhead, and that's a lot of work. And so one of the things we've been doing at Webair is really taking best of breed technology and software and putting it together, acting as the glue between all these really sort of edge technologies, and delivering it as a service to our customers. And so that's why we use Veeam, obviously, but also there's some awesome networking technologies that we can use to help solve a problem like this here, where instead of having to duplicate everything, we can really use software-defined networking to say, you know what, there's a better way. And what we recommend is to take some of those connections and instead of duplicating them at production and DR, bring those connections to a network fabric. Maybe something like Equinix's ECX or a Megaport or a Packet Fabric, and there's these companies popping up every day. 2 days ago, another one, Akira, popped up. And so bring those connections from your third party to a network as a service product, and now you can interact with that third party connection as if it was a VM. Just like when you went from physical servers to VMs and now it's an image and you can modify it, you can do the same thing with your cross connects and your transport. So I can take that connection to a network platform, and during a DR event, I can hit the button in the portal, or I can do it with an API, and I can say fail over that link to my DR site. So now I don't need 2 connections to Fiserv, and I don't have to manage double the routers. I can literally just fail over connectivity the same way that I do my workloads. And so this is what we advocate with our customers. We implement this and we make it part of the DR strategy. So now, just like the VMs and even the physical servers are so easy to sort of drag over and drag back from production to DR, we can do the same thing with physical connectivity, cross connects, private connectivity, all that sort of stuff. So I get really excited about this because it's really essentially virtualizing connectivity just like VMs are virtualized. So this really helps us with DR, and it saves a lot of headaches there because really, again, the network is the biggest blocker for a proper DR strategy. We can do the same thing on the internal side too. Before, a minute ago, I spoke about integrating the DR site with your existing MPLS network and your existing internal VPN mesh and all that. And when you look at supporting individual application failover, if you say, hey, I want to fail over this one VM or this one app, from a networking perspective, a lot of vendors and providers say, yeah, you can do that, no problem, as long as that application sits in its own subnet and with its own VLAN, yeah, we can move that back and forth. But as you know, modern enterprises, there's a lot of legacy networks, and you might have 5 or 10 applications sitting in the same subnet. You might have a completely flat network, and it's not so easy. I've tried, suggesting to customers, yeah, we can do per application failover. You just need to re-IP your network. Forget it. No one wants to re-IP their network. So there are some other things that we can do here to ease the pain. One is, if you are already using SD-WAN, or you plan to, or if you're already using zero trust security tools, people don't realize it, but now it gives you, again, a software-defined policy-based interface to tell an organization that a workload lives either at production or DR. And so with SD-WAN, we can build a policy in the controller to say this specific IP or this specific application lives at the production site, and we build another policy where it states it was at the DR site. And during DR, we just disable one policy and enable the other. And now we can skip the physical routing and switching and firewall layer, and we can just do that workload mobility and application redirection using an SD-WAN integration or using a zero trust security integration. So the beautiful thing is, a lot of our customers, when they come to us asking for help with DR, they're already looking at sort of maybe SD-WAN to replace an older type of circuit network, or they're already looking at these new sort of security tools. So we can show them how we can put these things together and make DR failover and failback happen much faster. So that's kind of, I didn't want to get too crazy on the networking, but those are the types of conversations that we have with our customers, and those are some of the things that we bring in and integrate with so that we can solve some of these traditional issues. Just wanted to briefly touch on some of the others. One of the things we advocate is whatever dependency services you need, whatever is required for your VMs to boot up, we recommend always running them at the DR site. And so that's typically going to be authentication, security, and network services. So, a lot of people talk about, well, let's run a read-only domain controller at the DR site. Yeah, of course, no doubt about it. Run your Duo proxies, your authentication services, all that should always be running at the DR site. The way that we set up the networking as well is all the internal networking is the same. We're not going to re-IP any of the servers. The default gateway stays the same. We typically use like an NSX edge service gateway to mimic those internal gateways. So none of the networking should ever change. And I haven't seen an organization where we couldn't make that happen in. And then also think about the fact that maybe you don't need to replicate specific workloads. Maybe some of your applications already have inherent built-in clustering capabilities that are better than replication. And I'll give you one example, which is the obvious one, which is SQL Server. So let's say you have a SQL Server at production and it's housing 20 databases, one database for each of your applications. And going back to the failover type discussion, you want to be able to support failing over individual apps. Well, so are you going to bring over your SQL Server to the DR site when you fail over? Well, now you have split brain, right? And now you have some databases being changed in production, some at DR. So yeah, you can spin up a separate SQL VM and stick it in each application and bring it over. That's a great idea. Or obviously you can do like a SQL cluster, like an availability group. And so again, those are the types of conversations we have, and we'd recommend what are the other. Yeah, you can bring over your SQL Server and export and import specific databases back, but DR should not involve 5 days of manual work. So look at, speak to your application vendors, see if they support sort of application level clustering. When we work with Cerner for hospitals, even if it's like a P-series box with IBM, they support that. They have their own scripts, and so it should not always be assumed that replication is the best route. We really have to look at each of your applications that you're looking to protect and come up with what's best. Same thing with the VDI. You cannot just replicate VDI. You really need to have a strategy around that. So if it's Horizon, you can look at the cloud pod architecture, but maybe you don't need all the bells and whistles. Maybe you just need a bunch of desktops. So oftentimes we'll give our customers X amount of desktops at the DR site, which is already privately connected to DR. And then I can have a whole other conversation about all these legacy and edge platforms, but essentially at Webair, we have enough sort of tools where we can replicate all of these different sorts of things. We have different data movers and strategies, and sometimes it's native. If our customers are using Nimble storage and they have direct iSCSI mounts into VMs, and there's not a good data mover, we do Nimble replication as a service. Sometimes it's best to stick with the vendor's own tool and integration. Typically, they're the fastest. We'll use Isilon SyncIQ to replicate Isilons. We'll still support Snap Mirror replication and Equalogic replication. and all of that. And I'm sure, Dave, I know that you've sort of been watching this industry for longer than I have. I'm sure when you look like the good, the bad, the ugly, you probably have more war stories than I do here.
Yeah, I think you hit on a lot of great challenges, and part of the challenge is, things don't typically go away. There's always edge case scenarios, like an iSeries server that still runs one or two critical applications, or some piece of equipment, or some application that maybe was proprietary but still needs to be supported. It's really looking at the complete aspect of what goes into providing the business function, this idea of dependencies, and then being able to ensure that you've got operational understanding of if you have any gaps is really critical. So if we think a little bit about this from a compliance perspective.
What are your thoughts here on compliance?
Yeah, I mean, part of this is you have to know what your current situation is, and you may have to be able to prove that internally and externally. That means you need to know what your gaps are ahead of time. And you need to understand things like what machines are protected and not, where are your vulnerabilities, if data is going to be required to stay within certain boundaries, you've got to be able to prove that you're actually adhering to that. You've got a lot to consider, but you really need a dashboard. This is an example of our Veeam One reporting product to answer some of these questions you see on the left, but not only answer them from an operational perspective, but to be able to satisfy either third-party audits or internal regulations and requirements, and now increasingly broader global requirements from a legal perspective to ensure that you're properly managing the environment. Now, that said though, one thing that we really haven't touched on that becomes really important though is how is this going to be achieved? If we think about this from a runbook perspective, understanding what you have in this compliance frame is very important, but this is really right here where it all comes together, meaning the ability to test. And I thought it was a great point you made, Sagi, about failing over is one thing, failing back is often where the challenges come into play. It's not something that most organizations are highly skilled at, and having a very well-defined executable process to automate this and to be able to do this with consistency and with a known positive outcome is really critical. Now, here's an example of a template, and the challenge that I've typically seen is that most organizations don't test very often. They don't particularly document particularly well, and oftentimes they get basically they fall victim to configuration drift. If they had a well-defined run book, it's unfortunately aged or doesn't account for all of the many systems that Sagi alluded to earlier. And so now they expose themselves to greater risk.
Yeah, and what you said, I'm just going to go back to the compliance one, because what you mentioned about compliance just reminding me of how much misinformation there is, in the marketplace when it comes to compliance. I mean, as a disaster recovery as a service provider, we field a lot of these compliance questions, and what I noticed is people are just asking the wrong questions. People say, hey, we're a healthcare provider, do you sign a BAA? And yeah, we do, but what I tell them is hey, you're really asking the wrong question. Anybody signs BAAs, public clouds sign BAAs, but the real question is, what does the BAA cover? You go to like a public cloud or a co-location facility, the BAA covers the fact that no one's breaking into the facility and stealing a physical disk. If you're consuming a service, the real question is, what's covered under the BAA? What am I procuring from you that's not covered by your breach liability? Same thing with SOC 2 audits. People are saying, do you have SOC 2 certification? Again, wrong question. The real question is, let me see your SOC 2 audit, and I want to see, if you've had any exceptions in the last 5 years in the audit. What do the auditors find? So I think there's a lot of misinformation, and here too is an area where people are sort of shying away from doing disaster recovery with anybody outside of their internal teams, because they have network requirements or security requirements, and they assume that anything that I do outside of my own hardware or my own facilities, my own network, is going to break that paradigm. But some of the stuff I showed before with the private networking integration and the way to present a third-party cloud or a managed provider inside the network means that you can really consume a service, a DR or a cloud service within the existing network and security paradigms that your organization's already created, right? Cloud shouldn't be, hey, we need an exception. You know, we know we have these rules, but we need an exception because we really need this. No, there is a way to have your cake and eat it too. You can consume OpEx-based cloud disaster recovery as a service and keep it within your private network paradigm, your security paradigm, and all your compliance requirements. And really, it just comes down to flexibility. You know, finding partners that are not just cookie cutter based, but are willing to kind of be bespoke and flexible. I'm sorry, I just wanted to jump on that. And I think we need to update this run book here. You know, this is our template from a year or 3 ago. And like you said, these things are always being updated.
Yeah, one thing we haven't really touched on yet is the security aspect of this. And this is unfortunately an increasing concern because of the attack surface that the data center really represents. And you know, from an exposure perspective, you know, oftentimes people mistakenly think that they can fail over to an environment that, you know, might not be as good as what they have on primary. It might not be as secure. It might not be as resilient or performant, or it might be a makeshift of other technologies and vendors. And that's really exposing a number of potential issues for them. Really, this first left bullet is the key. Your security should be as good or even better than your production environment. I mean, if you think about it, at the point you fail over, your production essentially is your DR site. You have either lost or lost confidence in your primary site. And so now it's not the time to suddenly realize, oh, we've got issues or exposures with our security practice. You've got to, instead of trying to handle things from a one-off perspective, you know, align yourself with the exact same tools, the exact same rigor that you have in your primary data center. And really, DR needs to conform to your production security and network standards, not be something that's in deviation of that. Your DR needs to be more resilient, not less.
Yeah, right. I mean, because if you think about it, all someone has to do is sort of just, you know, attack your production site or DDoS your production, force you into this scenario where they force you to fail over to DR, and maybe now there's exposure. If it's less secure, you know, a very simple way to force exposure. And you know, I agree it needs to be just as secure, but I think also, you know, one of the things that we've been doing with Veeam, I know that you guys have been adding a lot of really great sort of technology into the replication and backup software to help, you know, with security. And I would welcome people to think about the DR site and infrastructure not only being as secure as production, but leverage it to help improve your overall security stance. And what I mean by that is you happen to have a copy of all your most critical data and applications sitting out somewhere else, regardless of where it is. It's sitting there. Obviously, you want to protect it, but it's sitting there and it's usable, right? I mean, you know, Webair, we let our customers use the replica environment for free for 3 days out of every month. Log in, spin it up, do whatever you want with it. And if you can do that, you know, you can run your security scans against it. And in order to do that, you really need to bring over whatever tools you have. So whatever you're using today for your security monitoring, if you have sort of IDS, IPS sort of tools, if you have a physical hardware appliance from a security vendor sitting at your data center, the first thing you have to consider is, like Dave said, DR needs to fit within the confines of your existing security paradigm. So you need to bring over all of the existing security hardware, software, whatever you have today to DR. That's table stakes. You have to protect it just as good. But now if it's at the DR site, and if you can use the DR infrastructure for free, or if it's your own hardware, you know, scan against your applications there instead of scanning your environment once a year or twice a year in an intrusive, you know, pre-scheduled way. Scan against it weekly, and maybe you can reduce exposure of vulnerabilities at production of your production applications by making better use of your DR strategy. So I don't think people have a choice. You've got to bring over those same security tools and integrations with third-party vendors over to the DR site. So you might as well use it, you know, for the better good of the organization.
Thanks, Sagi. Thanks, Dave. I think, you know, lots of detail there. Really good overview of some of the nuts and bolts and some of the things that organizations need to think about as they approach and build a disaster recovery plan. I think, you know, when you get to those decision points, I think one of the important things is to figure out, you know, how am I going to go about this? Can I go down one path or the other? One path being, hey, you know, you can call Dave and the team at Veeam, and you can do this on your own with Veeam software, or you can walk the other, you know, go to the door number 2, and you can use a third-party managed service provider, infrastructure provider like Webair. Both of these organizations are happy to help you in their own specific way. But I wanted to give you a little bit of background on what we're seeing from our research to give you a sense of what is, you know, what model, deployment model organizations have been using out there. As you can see on the on your left on the screen, this is some of a quick chart that aggregates the outsourced infrastructure spend over a 5-year period. As you can see, there's a significant amount of incremental growth each year as more outsourcing, as more outsourced infrastructure is being consumed. If you look on the chart on the right, kind of in a pie chart format, you'll see, if you note the blue, I think that's the main takeaway there. 2018-19 period, in the last few years, we've seen, you know, on-premise, the do-it-yourself model still being prevalent across mid to large size organizations. According to our research, that's roughly around 75%, or, you know, roughly 3/4 of IT infrastructure spend is done in that model. But if you follow our chart and the growth and the projections hold, you'll see the reddish part become much more predominant as organizations used managed infrastructure, and they use more co-location as they move to hyperscale/public clouds, which we, you know, envision will be the dominant platform. So as you can see, as the growth trends and the uptake continue, we're going to see a world where outsourced infrastructure is the predominant model. Moving to the next slide there. Yeah, so do it yourself or work with a service provider. You know, what we're seeing in our research, as you can, is increased uptake of service providers, and a big part of that is I like to just summarize it as economies of scale and economies of expertise. Third-party organizations are agnostic. They scale what they do. They've gone through repeated trials. They've built blueprints and plans, and they've scaled that, all of the experiences, all of the expertise, and the ability to procure and implement software and hardware and then deliver that as a service to the organization. You're not purchasing necessarily technology, you're not deploying a lot of internal expertise, but you are purchasing an SLA, a capability, a partnership. You're handing over liability, bringing peace of mind into your organization, and you're letting that MSP or service provider tailor things in the way you need, be a partner that's on call you know, that you can reach out to at any time that you have a problem, to continue to fine tune the solution that you've implemented. And you can allow them to innovate as you focus on your core business. And that's what we find, that message really resonates, and that's why we've seen in our tracking significant outsourced infrastructure growth, and why the third-party service provider model has become increasingly popular. People will mix and match, but they've definitely been slanting that way. So with that, I'm going to let Sagi actually go through the ins and outs and the nuts and bolts of what you could expect if you decide to go to door number 2, that service provider door.
Yeah, I think that was a great way to kind of state the 2 paths there. And we also, you know, we strongly believe in hybrid. You know, I think that I'm not going to sit here and say, you know, this is the way that everybody has to go, because it all really comes down to ownership and accountability. And, you know, what is your appetite for being responsible for all the different ins and outs? You know, people think of disaster recovery as a service of simply, I'm going to rent the sort of infrastructure, the CPU, memory, the disk, the network as a service from a provider, and then, you know, and then everything else is on me. So I think it's important to note that when you consume disaster recovery as a service, not only is it all the infrastructure you're getting as a service from an OpEx perspective, but a truly managed DR as a service, like the one that Webair provides, it's us taking ownership and accountability of all these other components here, of monitoring the replication 24/7, of having a 15-minute response time to do something about it, of even though we provide you with complete self-service control for the entire disaster recovery infrastructure and environment, and even though you can log in and spin it up whenever you want, it's being able to just call us and say, hey, we're having a problem, we need to fail over right now, fail us over. And us staying on the phone with you and your application vendors until everything is up and performing properly. It's also owning the failback process, ensuring everything comes back properly. It's owning the testing process. And the reality is, do you want to manage infrastructure, or do you want to hold a provider accountable to an SLA to say that, we're going to do all this, and at the end of the day, we're going to give you let's say a 15-minute or a 1-hour RPO and a 1-hour RTO. And so these are all the things that we sort of take ownership of with our customers, the ones that decide they kind of want to consume it as a service. Because of the flexibility we bring from a network, security, and compliance capability, we haven't found an organization that was so big with all sorts of technical debt or intricate requirements where we couldn't service them. We do really well with that enterprise market. So that's why we support the I series and the P series and all these crazy network configurations. Well, this is what you get. And the other thing too is to consider that when you consume disaster recovery as a service, it's not all or nothing. You might have 30% of your environment that you want to protect. So now, the way that you pay for disaster recovery as a service is just based on the number of servers that you're replicating and the amount of storage they're consuming. Now you can get all of this for a small subset, whereas if you were to do it yourself, you'd have to go and deploy the hardware and have all the operational overhead by managing it yourself. So this is what we include. If you look at the actual service offering, these are the platforms that we support today. We'll do disaster recovery for physical servers and VMs, Hyper-V, VMware. We do use Veeam as the data mover. If you already own Veeam, great. You can plug us right in really easily. If you don't already own Veeam, then we'll bring it and we'll help you install it and get it all up and running and tune it. And like Phil said, we bring along with us all of our battle scars of having configured replication, disaster recovery for all sorts of different environments. Over the last 10 years, everything that we learn, the good, the bad, the ugly, we bring that during the onboarding process. Ultimately, it is fully managed. As I mentioned before, you can use the infrastructure on our side for free for legitimate events or for testing for 3 days out of the month. We're not, the metrics by which we bill are super easy. How many servers and how much storage. There's no operation fees or egress, ingress. There's no gotchas. It's meant to be extremely predictable and perpetual from a billing perspective. So from procurement, there's no nightmares there. And we're never going to charge hourly fees because there was this one application that didn't come up properly. This is all as a service with SLAs, and there's no limit on the amount of CPU, memory, or disk. The SLAs provide the same performance as production, and it's really just meant to be everything provided with that white bow on it. So this is what we include. We provide the service out of a bunch of regions globally. The reason that we're in all these different regions is because we work with many multinational organizations, which, as Dave mentioned, have very strict compliance requirements for data sovereignty. Their applications and data in France can't leave France, or stuff in the EU, cannot leave the EU. And that's how we have recovery environments sort of all over the world. And we provide, one single point of accountability, one company that can provide this global DRAS and sort of meet all their global compliance needs, as well as all those technical integrations required. And then, as mentioned, from a compliance perspective, we kind of hit all those touch points as well. For GDPR, we have our DPA, FISMA for federal government, and a bunch of others there. And as discussed, Veeam is sort of the data mover of choice. We like it a lot because with one tool, we can hit all of the requirements for backups and disaster recovery and monitoring. So Dave, I'll kick this over to you. I don't know if there's any specific components of the software you want to highlight. I know that I could talk about how great it is for a while too.
Yeah, well, you've been an absolute advocate and really a wonderful supporter of Veeam. And I think really at Veeam, what we strive to offer is a solution that can handle all of your critical workloads, but be flexible enough to work in meeting your requirements. And flexible from a software perspective, meaning deploy it on the hardware of your choice to be able to be positioned for handling legacy workloads, more modern workloads, and then transitioning into increasingly hybrid cloud world. One platform to be able to cover your cloud, SaaS, virtual, physical needs. Now, first and foremost, you've got to be able to ensure the integrity of the data you capture. You buy a backup solution so that you can recover. And I think, as you pointed out, a lot of work has gone into trying to make the platform even more extensible, but also operate in a very secure manner to help you fend off external threats or to handle eventualities that come across in a disaster situation. Now, part of that is looking at some of the monitoring and operational aspects of the solution. We have a product called Veeam One. It's our reporting solution, and one of my colleagues likes to say that everybody that uses this product discovers something that they didn't know that they wish they would have known earlier. And in some cases, it's as simple as this one report looking at what machines are protected and what machines are not protected. And if you've been in the industry long enough, you've got a phone call where eventually someone says they want a server back and you didn't even know that the server was running some critical application, or you might not have even known the server existed. Some IT environments are very fluid. And so just understanding operationally what's going on so that you can head off problems ahead of time becomes really, really critical. And so when we think about the two partnerships of Webair and Veeam providing a platform, but also a service, I think this is really where the value comes into play, because as you mentioned, Sagi, I'll throw it back over to you, but this is a contact sport, right? You get bumps and bruises trying to do this in real time, and the lessons learned are really invaluable if you can short circuit that process and be able to partner with someone that knows the best practices, that knows what the gotchas are going to be before you actually experience them.
Yeah, and to that end, I mean, we work with huge organizations whose IT teams are probably the same size as maybe even our entire company, and they have the capability to do it themselves, and they have data centers, but they just have too much stuff that they're responsible for. So DR is just such a nice thing that you can just slice off and consume as a service in the cloud. If you're not already using the cloud, what a better use case to just put off to the side there as a foray into hybrid cloud. And even with us, even we're outsourcing, right? We're not sitting here building our own data movers. We're vetting and doing R&D and bringing Veeam as a best-in-class data mover. We're bringing some of those networking technologies that I showed, storage technologies, and we're just sort of owning the glue there between everything and delivering it based on an SLA. And I think here's an example of a sample customer that we did not too long ago. I like this one just because it kind of touches on a lot of those points. It was fun, and it's very representative of what we do. This customer happened to have requirements for disaster recovery of over 3,000 devices all over the world, requirement of disaster recovery for IBM platforms too, some native storage. They needed the data in specific countries for compliance. They needed backend connectivity between all the recovery sites, MPLS tie-ins. They had a very strong HIPAA requirement as well, and some other global healthcare requirements. And we were able to, install Veeam at about 100 or so of their branch offices for them. Where we walked them through it. We essentially onboarded 100 locations and got off this sort of global, huge disaster recovery implementation for them. Done, within about 4 months. And again, there was sort of like no compliance or networking or gotcha that they were able to throw off that we couldn't achieve between Veeam and Webair. And you mentioned Veeam One before, and this is what's been great for this particular client, where now there's one compliance manager who sits globally for all these sort of sites across the world, and he can run one report and instantly find which of his specific locations is out of compliance with the global with the global data requirement, right? If it's one office in Brazil that hit the wrong button, he knows, he gets on the phone with them and he asks them why. And so the reporting capability, I think, is just, it's just table stakes if you have to comply to SOX or for other requirements. And so, people like to think of Veeam as like it's quick and simple, you can get up and running. And I think sometimes people think of from that perspective that it's meant for small environments. It's absolutely not. I mean, this thing scales tremendously well, and you can see it here. And here's just some other diagrams, right? Like the way that these sort of diagrams show up, it's different for every customer. What's your connectivity requirements? What are your platforms, right? There's no cookie cutter solution here. And so the way that these diagrams show up, as we build them for our customers, it's all dependent upon what your environment looks like today. Here's a bank one, here's a hospital one, and I can show you 30 other implementations that were very unique to our customer's environment, where we were able to slide in and provide disaster recovery as a service, again, within that context of what they already created. And so I think the overarching message is, think hybrid, right? Don't think so black and white. It's either on-prem or cloud, or I can't do cloud because of my connectivity, or I have to keep it in my data center. The whole world's going hybrid, and I think DR is such a great way to get started with this, especially with the flexibility that we can bring there.
Thanks, guys. We're getting close to the top of the hour. Thanks, everyone, for staying on. Right now, we're going to open the floor to questions, so we can give you maybe a minute or so. There's in the GoToWebinar control panel, there's a section for questions. I'm not seeing anything right now, but if you'd like to ask a question of Dave and Sagi, please do so. While we wait, maybe I'll just throw a few questions at Sagi and Dave right now. Start with Sagi. Obviously noticed the Amazon and Azure logos on the last slide there, talking about hybrid. The question, why would a customer that's using Webinar, why would they use, Webair, not Webinar, for DR instead of a public cloud? Why would they go to a service provider rather than go direct?
That's a great question. I think if you're in the boat of we want to do it ourselves, we have an appetite to own everything and be responsible for the infrastructure, then public cloud makes a lot of sense, because now you're not having the conversation around all the management. You've already decided that you're willing to be responsible for everything. And so now it's, do I buy hardware or do I use a public cloud? Now, I'll tell you why people go to us, and that might help, lend some credence to maybe why public cloud might not be so great. But when we provide disaster recovery as a service, as I said before, we want to keep everything as similar as possible to production. We don't want to jump through any hoops. And that's why we typically will use the same technology that you're running in production. So if you're running on VMware at production, you're going to replicate and failover and come right up from VMware on our side. The technology is the same. And that means you're not going to run into any of these gotchas like you do with public cloud, where there's a different number of virtual interfaces that are supported, in Azure versus VMware, or there's these other technical gotchas that you run into. So we keep everything the same. That way our customer also gets a vSphere interface like they're used to. They can log in, change the resources, increase CPU, memory, disk, console to VM. So we keep all the technology the same. And also for the enterprise in specific, all of those sort of gotchas and additional requirements around private networking and putting your security company's physical 1U security appliance in front of your DR infrastructure, those are increasingly more difficult to do in a public cloud, tying into your MPLS. So because we have our own sort of infrastructure, physical infrastructure that we run, we can support all of those things. If you want to co-locate your own NetApp clusters that you replicate yourself side by side to the DR as a service, we can do that. And so if you're just looking to replicate a few VMs over and have what I would call like a boot and browse capability, meaning I can boot up my VMs, I can do a simple VPN and log in, I think public cloud's great. If you're looking for a legitimate DR strategy, like you said, Phil, at the beginning, where it's going to be less painful to fail over than to pay a ransom, I think what we provide is a lot more meaningful to deal with those legitimate use cases.
Great feedback. Just a reminder to everyone who's still on the webinar, thanks for sticking with us. Hope you're getting a lot out of it. There is a question box in the GoToWebinar control panel where you can ask a question. But as we wait for that, maybe I'll throw another one at both of you. Just in thinking about this, what about customers who right now might be on this call or who are already using Veeam, who would want to use, who are compelled by this, they have maybe more sophisticated requirements. They want to move to a third-party service provider model. So they're already using Veeam, who are interested in using Webair for offsite backup and DR. Are they able to simply start using it, or do they need to reinstall the software or make other changes? What would you guys, either one of you, recommend to the customer in that kind of situation?
Yeah, well, the beautiful thing is it's very flexible. I mean, the product natively supports something we call Cloud Connect to be able to link out to a service provider. So there isn't anything separate that you have to install if you're already using Veeam. You certainly don't have to reinstall. And with Webair, Sigi, you can speak to this very well, but you're not going to force a customer to do anything unnatural from either a licensing perspective or from an operational point of view.
Yeah, it's really simple. If you're already running Veeam, we can provide you with credentials that you can plug right into your existing Veeam software, and you can just start building replication jobs right to us, and that can be set up and running within a day. And now, once the replication's up and running, you can just log in, boot up your VMs from our side, and like we've been talking about, nothing changes. So it's very easy to bolt on disaster recovery as a service for anyone who already has Veeam today, regardless if you're doing any sort of replication today at all or not.
Okay, maybe we just squeeze in a quick one more question before we go. Maybe this one I think is a bit more for Dave. Can Veeam provide instant or near instant access to data for customers that are interested in that?
Yeah, the short answer is yes. The longer answer is actually Veeam pioneered that concept in 2010, literally a decade ago. And what we've done in our most recent version, version 10 of our product, is we really dramatically accelerated and improved that, meaning we can now take literally hundreds of machines and bring them back near instantly. And it's really a pretty complex notion of aggressive prefetching, larger tunable buffers, but the net of all that is not only can you bring back a machine rapidly, we can bring back several machines very rapidly. And that doesn't mean that you have to be on any specific hardware, which is not dependent on, say, SSDs, but that power definitely exists.
Great. I don't think there are any more questions right now. We just got about a minute left, so I think it's a good time to thank everyone for joining us this afternoon, and hope you guys are all staying safe. Before we go, I just want to remind everyone that as an attendee of the webinar, you'll be automatically entered to win a $100 gift card to a popular food delivery service. 3 lucky attendees will win, and the winners will be announced on Webair's LinkedIn page tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. Eastern time. So please make sure to get onto LinkedIn and follow their page. If you follow Webair on LinkedIn, an additional entry will be entered in your name. So that's a little nice bonus. Additionally, if you have other questions, feel free to send Webair a message. The email address is webinars, that's webinars plural, at webair.com, or give them a call. It's 1-866-WEBAIR-1 or 1-866-932-2471.
Hey, Phil.
Yeah.
I just wanted to jump in. I just noticed 2 questions popped up real quick, so I just wanted to address them. One was, do you need, actually really the same question, do you need to have anything on premises to use Veeam with Webair? Are there any additional licensing costs for local Veeam installs? The only thing that you need to have on premises in order for us to provide disaster recovery as a service is just Veeam running. And that can be running simply as virtual machines, right? If you're already running VMware or Hyper-V and you want to use disaster recovery through us, you just need to have Veeam running in your virtual environment. If you don't already own Veeam, then we will provide you with the full-on enterprise version of Veeam as part of the service. We include all of those licenses, so you don't even have to go out and buy it third party. If you already own it, then you can just start replicating to us. There's no additional license cost at all required to start replicating for disaster recovery or even for offsite backups to Webair if you already have Veeam. And so if you have it already, you don't need to buy anything else. If you don't have it, we can actually sell it to you as part of the service that we provide. And then I think there was one other one. As far as specific versions, we support all versions of Veeam. We are already running the latest version, which is V10, and that means that we're completely backwards compatible with all of the previous versions. So if you have version 9 or 9.5, you can replicate to us. And again, we can actually provide you with the Veeam software licenses as part of the service, and you pay for it on a per server basis. And so we give you that local software included as part of the disaster recovery service. So we don't really care if you buy it through your VAR or MSP, whoever. If you're already owning Veeam or buy it perpetually, fine. If you don't have it, you can always get it through us. And I think you can probably contact us, sales@webair.com or webinars, and we're happy to follow up and have a deeper conversation.
Thanks, Sagi. I'll just repeat those contact numbers just for everyone still on the call. It was webinars@webair.com, and the phone number was 1-866-932-2471. So thanks again, everyone, for attending the webinar, and hope you got a lot out of it, and definitely stay safe, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Phil. Thanks, Dave.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sagi. Thanks, Dave.